Two last parts are going to be on abortions. And just a repetition of what you probably know, that the definition of an abortion is the termination of a pregnancy before the fetus is viable outside the uterus. The gestational age of viability depends on the level of care and technology. When I studied medicine, it was the 28 week that was put as the limit, as the change. Then it went down to, has gone down to 25 weeks. We have a law that says 22 weeks, which is a bit problematic because that has been put by politicians and not by science. It's hardly any fetus that can live outside the uterus with a reasonable life at the gestational age of 22 weeks, which is an illustration of what happens when the politicians are actually taking technical decisions. Pregnancy starts when the fertilized ovum is implanted in the uterus mucosa. And there are, of course, two types. There's spontaneous abortions, which is 15% of all pregnancies. That means established pregnancies. And then a big percentage of the fertilized ova actually discharged. And then we have missed abortions that do not manifest themselves as clinically. But I'm going to talk about induced abortion. I just want to have this list just for the completion of the whole picture. WHO has defined safe abortion as an abortion done by qualified staff with appropriate drugs and equipment. And then an unsafe abortion is then any abortion which is outside this. That means not done by a skilled provider and not having access to the right drugs and equipment. Legal abortion, on the other hand, is an abortion carried out in accordance with a national or state legislation. Some countries have state legislation, for instance, Australia, the US also. Norway is, of course, in both the state and the nation. So anything done not according to the law will then be an illegal abortion. An illegal abortion can be safe or unsafe, depending on how it's carried out. And for instance, in Norway, in Oslo, we had a clinic, Wergelandsveiens clinic, which was known for carrying out safe illegal abortions at a cost. And this is also reflected in the world today. Safe abortion is always available to those who can pay, regardless of the legislation. And therefore, unsafe abortion is to an extreme extent a problem for the poor, and not just how the abortions are carried out, but also when women come for complications after unsafe abortions. Safe abortions are safe, which means there are hardly any complications, but unsafe abortions create a lot of complications. And when women come with complications, they often have to pay an enormous amount of money. If they're taken to court, they can't afford to have a proper defense lawyer. So it's really an extreme poverty issue. The whole unsafe abortion is an extreme poverty issue. If we look at the total number of induced abortions in the world, these figures say 121 million unintended pregnancies. A previous presentation said 111. Just an illustration that it's hard to get to the proper data, and there are different models and they come to slightly different results, but at least more than 100 million unintended pregnancies. And of these, approximately 73 million abortions are carried out. Again, there are confidence intervals in this. Of these abortions, approximately 32 million are carried out in an unsafe way. And almost all of these happen in developing countries or low-cost or poor countries. And in Africa and Latin America, 3 out of 4 abortions are unsafe. Due to strict abortion legislation and lack of services, lack of access to services for those who need it. These are actually quite late data, quite recent data. And if you look at the consequence of unsafe abortions, 7 million persons are hospitalized for complications each year. And then, of course, there are those who never come to any treatment. The number of deaths is presently estimated at 23,000, which has actually been halved during the last 10 years. So there has been a good development in terms of deaths from abortions. It's still high numbers, still unnecessary, but it has been a good development. There's some disturbing information that we're getting presently, and I'll come back to that. And if we look at maternal mortality, the maternal deaths, then between 4.7 and 13.2%, depending on the situation in the country, they are from unsafe abortion. And again, you see the illogicality of calling this maternal death. These are women who die from an abortion because they refuse to become mothers during that pregnancy, and still we call it maternal death. I think it's a big paradox, and I hope that we can one day agree, the whole world can agree on a different term. The incidence of abortion, it depends on accessibility to family planning, contraceptives, sexuality education, gender equality. It's very important to have what you call negotiating power, whether you can say no to unwanted sex, and then of course you have more control over your fertility. When politicians adopt a law, it's because they want. If they ban something, it's because they don't want it to happen. Abortion laws, however, do not stop abortions from happening. Actually, where there is strict legislation, the rates tend to be high. It is not because of the law at all, because there's no cause and effect relationship between the law and the incidence. But countries that have strict abortion legislation also tend to do poorly in access to family planning, sexuality education, and gender equality. And for those reasons, they have high rates of abortions. If we look at abortion legislation in developed or industrialized countries, then between 1950 and 1985, most industrialized countries and some others liberalized their laws. One country that is quite interesting that early got abortion on demand was Tunisia. It was the first country in the African continent to have abortion on demand. It was the early 1970s. And they used Islam as a reason for liberalizing the law. Because they said Islam does not discriminate between men and women, and strict abortion laws discriminate against women. We can't have that. It's quite interesting because it's a different way of using religion that we normally hear about and we are used to. Many former colonies in Africa and Asia still have the strict laws that the former colonial powers introduced. And one example is the Offence Against the Person Act, which is the British law from 1861, which is still enforced in many former British colonies. If we look at the whole world, there's an enormous variation from complete ban, which means you cannot even perform an abortion to save the woman's life. And since the definition of an abortion is the termination of pregnancy before the fetus is viable, it also means that the fetus is dying. To call that pro-life is really an outrage in my view. Then many countries have abortion laws that say you can perform an abortion to save the woman's life, or you can do it if she's raped, if the pregnancy is because of incest, or if the fetus is not viable. And then to preserve her health, her physical health, her mental health, for socioeconomic reasons, but still decided by others. And Finland and the UK is actually an example. Great Britain is an example of abortion laws that are not on demand. The woman has to give a reason, and somebody else has to authorize that she is within the remits of the law. And then on demand, like in Norway. And Canada is an extreme case where there is complete deregulation, where abortion is seen as any other medical intervention that is necessary. But again, there's no cause and effect in terms of the legislation and the number and the rate of abortion. The first time in history that it was shown convincingly that strict abortion legislation kills women was in Romania. When they had their former dictator, Ceausescu, he introduced a very strict abortion law, not a complete ban, but a strict abortion law in the 1960s. The green curve here is the overall maternal mortality, and the red curve is the abortion-related mortality. And we see that after the introduction of the law, abortion-related deaths increased dramatically. And then he was executed on Christmas Day in 1989. And the day after, on Boxing Day, that's what the Romanians have insisted to me, the day after they introduced abortion on demand, and the abortion mortality among women fell dramatically. There was a slight increase in fertility. Ceausescu, of course, wanted more for Romanians, and that's why he introduced the ban. And there was a slight increase in fertility just 1 year, and then it leveled off and was the same as before. So the overall result was actually more death of women and no more children. In 2007, WHO published this graph where all the countries in the world have got one dot, and it's the comparison between the number of deaths attributable to unsafe abortion per 100,000 live births. Again, the normal parameter for assessing maternal mortality. And then we see that there is a clear link between the strictness. The ones to the left are the strictest, where the strictest laws are, and one to the right where the most liberal laws are. Although there are some exceptions. I've been personally working in Sri Lanka that has a very strict abortion law, the old British law, and they have low mortality because they have ready access to health care. And I guess that many are actually carried out by health staff illegally but safely. But we see that there is a clear link between the safety and the legality. So, in some, abortion laws do not impact on the abortion rates, but on the death of women. There is a need for legal literacy. It's hard often to understand laws. Laws are written in special ways, and a lawyer friend of mine said once, I was reading a law and I couldn't understand it. He said, but remember, it's legalese. He said, as if it's a separate language. So it's difficult to understand the content of the law. And health staff are very often afraid of breaking the law, therefore interpret the law often much more restrictive than the law actually is. When I was working in Tanzania, I was a health advisor at the embassy in Tanzania, Norwegian embassy in Tanzania, and I discovered that even the government interpreted the abortion law much stricter than it actually was. And sometimes there can be very complicated procedures that hinder safe legal abortions, and Bolivia and Poland are two examples. Bolivia had a law saying that one could have a legal abortion for rape. They had the law for 20 years before they used it for the first time because the procedure was so complicated. Poland is a neighboring country of ours. They have a rather liberal law, actually, but the interpretation is extremely strict, and it's become even stricter. So, and sometimes actually court cases can interpret laws in much more liberal way than health staff and even lawyers do normally. So sometimes there's a need to take a case to court and then have a more liberal interpretation and clarification of what health staff can do. There are good examples. I won't go into those. And then there are some interesting, what we call intermediary solutions. Bangladesh has the abortion law, the British abortion law from 1861, which says that you can only have a legal abortion to save the woman's life. It's the only exception. But But then they have what they call menstrual regulation, which is actually an early abortion, but before the 8th week of pregnancy, and with no pregnancy test, and they call it re-establishment of non-pregnancy. It's a fantastic term, which I think is a way that the politicians are trying to balance the opposition to abortion with the need to save women's lives and menstrual regulation, and then the abbreviated MR, but it makes this even more mysterious, and then they can carry it out legally and save a lot of women's lives. During the last decades, a few countries have made abortion laws stricter. El Salvador and Nicaragua are 2 examples, and Poland has been a bit back and forth. They tried a few years ago to make it to make the law very strict. It was opposed and then it was withdrawn. Recently there has been more restrictive, because there was an opening for having a legal abortion for a damaged fetus, and that has now been taken away. And I think you may have seen or heard about the demonstrations in Poland over that. And the problem with Poland is also that they are very strict in the interpretation of the law, and they have a high number of health staff that claim conscientious objection to abortion. So that means access to abortion in Poland is extremely limited and difficult. But there's a much bigger number of countries that has liberalized their law. South Africa, where abortion mortality fell by 90% when they introduced the law on abortion on demand. When they did away with apartheid, they also did away with their old abortion law and got abortion on demand, and dramatically reduced the abortion mortality. Guyana, the first country on the South African continent to have abortion on demand. Nepal, Portugal, Mexico City, Uruguay, and Mozambique, they have got abortion on demand. Iceland, about a year and a half ago, got abortion on demand. Up till the 22nd of week, so now they have much more liberal law in Iceland than we have. While Ethiopia, Colombia and Brazil and others have expanded indications for abortion, but not gone to the extent of having an abortion on demand. In those countries that have liberalized the law, we see a dramatic decrease in mortality, and in the countries that have more restrictive law, there is an increase in maternal mortality related to abortion.